In ancient Rome, the line between rich and poor did not reveal itself first at the banquet table, but at the door that opened each morning, and in the height of the room one was forced to live in. The wealthy stepped into the domus, a single-family residence, with the atrium serving the household's public functions, and the private living quarters set deeper within, where order was shaped through space itself. Most laborers, by contrast, were crowded into insulae, multi-story rental buildings that rose because land was expensive and the population dense. Shops occupied the lower floors, while the upper levels were cramped, poorly equipped, and often dependent on public water and shared amenities. Cheap construction and limited water access made collapse and fire constant threats. Yet Rome did not divide people by brick walls alone. Each morning, the ritual of salutatio within the patron-client relationship reminded the city that power was sustained through patronage, obligation, and presence. If you'd like to look more deeply into that system, I invite you to subscribe and follow the next part. Beyond the city's threshold, inequality appears as an architectural drawing. For those with power, life begins in the domus, a single-family house arranged around the atrium and extending inward to the colonnaded court, the peristyle, where light, air, and privacy are designed into privilege. There, space serves status, a place to receive guests, a place to dine, a place to discuss affairs, a place to withdraw with the season. But for most urban residents, the address is the insula, a multi-story rental block where many families are stacked upon one another because land is compressed by population and profit. Both are called home, yet one is controlled order, while the other is life forced into a narrow frame. Rome, therefore, did not divide class by wealth alone. It divided by square footage, by light, and by the right to close a door. Within the insula, social layering follows the law of gravity. The lower floors near the street have shops, wider access, and easier contact with amenities. The upper levels become smaller rooms, hot in summer, cold in winter, and water does not always make the climb up the stairs. Hasty construction, cheap materials, and dense occupancy keep the danger of fire and collapse lurking like an unpaid debt. The poor did not merely rent shelter, they rented risk. And that risk was not distributed at random. It increased with height, with crowding, and with the absence of safe open space. So when we hear Rome praised for urban order, we must also hear the footsteps of those climbing stairways at night. A city may be disciplined, yet still let much of that discipline fall upon the shoulders of those with the least power. Once outside the home, class continues to operate through ritual. Each morning, the salutatio turns the entrance hall of a wealthy man's house into a window of social order. Dependents arrive to greet him, offer respect, and wait to be seen. The patron responds with promises, intervention in court, or daily support, sometimes food, later often money to sportula. This is not pure generosity. It is an unwritten social contract everyone understands. Protection exchange for loyalty, networks exchange for votes, the patron's honor exchange for the sound of people waiting each morning. Rome endured because these ties were repeated so regularly that the system came to seem natural. Yet that same regularity also locked the poor into the role of petitioners and made power a habit of everyday life. By afternoon, the city opens into shared spaces, bath, squares, spectacles. At first glance, this is Rome for everyone. But class rarely disappears. It simply changes form. The thermae were developed by the Romans into highly sophisticated complexes for bathing, leisure, and social exchange. And yet what the poor lacked was not only the entrance fee. They lacked time, the invisible asset the wealthy possessed in far greater abundance. When a man can spend hours in the bath, the reading room, or the exercise court, he is investing in social networks and opportunity. But the one who works to exhaustion enters the baths as a passerby, not as someone who belongs there. Rome created vast public spaces, but it could not level the rhythm of life. And rhythm, in the end, is the quiet measure of class. On Rome's streets, power had its own uniform. The tunica was a common base layer, but the toga was the true emblem of citizenship and rank, a heavy, many-folded garment that demanded a measured gait and unoccupied hands. That very inconvenience was part of the message. The man who wore a toga was not born to carry loads. He was born to appear, to speak, and to be given way. In time, the toga became a kind of national dress of status. Not everyone wore it, and not all times. In Rome, one did not merely wear clothing. One carried a social identity. And that identity shaped how others addressed you, stood near you, or kept their distance. Class, therefore, did not reside only in houses or money. It rested on the shoulders, in the folds of cloth, and in the gaze of the crowd. Yet Rome was not only a society of appearances, it was also a society of texts. When the law of the 12 tables was inscribed and publicly displayed in the Forum in the 5th century BCE, something changed. Law no longer existed only in memory and in the interpretive privilege of a small elite. Common citizens could know what was permitted and what was forbidden, at least in theory. Even so, written law did not automatically produce equality. Procedure and legal skill still favor those with education, connections, and the time to pursue a case. For the wealthy, law was an instrument for protecting property and honor. For the poor, it was often a labyrinth entered only when no other path remained. Rome made justice visible, but it never promised that everyone approached that stone platform with equal weight. Within the household, law and class were entwined more quietly. Roman tradition placed patria potestas, the authority of the father, at the center of the patrilineal family, governing children and the arrangement of property. In marriage, the model of Manus once granted the husband legal control over the wife, though over time forms of marriage without Manus became more common, allowing the spouse's property to remain separate in principle. This was not equality in the modern sense. It was a method of managing property and alliances. For the wealthy, the family was an institution for preserving land, reputation, and ties between houses. For the poor, it was a network of survival, fewer choices, more obligations. In Rome, power did not reside only in the Senate or the courts. It began at the table, with the authority to decide who belonged to whom. To speak of class in Rome while ignoring slavery is to ignore the foundation of the wall itself. Slaves were present in the domus, in shops, in workshops, and on farms, and the decisive boundary was not poor or rich, but free or owned. Roman law, in principle, treated slaves as property, making disenfranchised labor a permanent condition of daily life. Here lies the paradox. A civilization that revered law and organization could still place human beings in a category of objects. The splendor of marble and the order of the streets were upheld by hands without a voice. As we walk through the surviving temples and monuments, we should remember, Rome was not built by stone alone. It was built by status, and within that system, some statuses were never allowed to choose. Even so, Rome left a narrow opening for social movement. Manumitio, the freeing of a slave. The person granted freedom could step into a new legal condition, yet the bond of dependence usually changed form rather than disappeared. Ties to the former master became ties of patronage, obligations were renamed, and society still remembered one's origin. For that reason, freedmen became a class both dynamic and closely watched. They could trade, accumulate wealth, build families, and above all seek to leave a mark. Here, legacy meant more than inherited property. It meant the right to be remembered as someone who belonged to the city. And this is the natural bridge to what follows. Rome organized not only power, but also the longing for recognition among those at the edges of the system. When a slave was freed, Rome did not immediately grant equality. Rome granted a rung on the ladder. From this emerged the class of freedmen, men who could trade, accumulate wealth, and build families, yet still carry the mark of their origins in the eyes of society and in their ties to former masters. What is striking is that even within aristocratic households, many refined administrative tasks, scribal work, accounting, estate management, were often handled by slaves and the freed. In other words, the highest stratum frequently depended on the abilities of those who had once stood at the bottom in order to keep property and household affairs running. This did not erase class order. It made that order more efficient. Rome was intensely practical. Honor belonged to the master, while the skill that kept the machinery moving often rested in the hands of attendants. From the house and the shop, those in the lower strata sought another form of power, association. Roman collegia, private associations such as craft guilds, trade groups, burial societies, or religious fraternities, allowed members to stand together under a collective identity, hold common property, and manage affairs as a legal body. For the lower and middle ranks, this was no minor detail. It was a way of turning isolation into bargaining power. At life's end, burial societies were often connected with columbaria, structures for urns that became common in the early empire, frequently established for members of lower and middling classes. When one could not leave behind an estate, one could still leave behind a named place within a community. The place where class appears most clearly is not always the mansion, but the market. Roman urban markets had a distinctly bipolar character. The poor mainly purchased basic foodstuffs and a small range of simple manufactured goods, while the wealthy drove demand for luxury goods. Within that same structure, crafts and trade in Rome were largely operated by slaves and freedmen, while free elites often profited indirectly through ownership, shop rents, and patronage networks. The city, therefore, was not merely a place where goods were exchanged. It was a place where profit was separated from labor by layers of legal status and social rank. The poor were more visible in the marketplace, but not because they controlled it. Step away from the market and another paradox appears. Public infrastructure could be extensive, yet private comfort remained a privilege. In the typical Roman system, water from aqueducts was brought to distribution tanks, then directed to public baths and public fountains. Only a small number of the very wealthy or specially privileged households enjoyed private water lines. Surplus water also helped flush sewers, making water engineering part of urban sanitation. The Romans likewise developed water supply and drainage systems that operated largely by gravity. But having infrastructure did not mean having privacy. In places like Ostia, public latrines used running water to carry waste into the main sewer. It was an impressive technical achievement, and also a reminder that most residents lived within a shared regime of sanitation. Even warmth carried the mark of class. The Romans developed the hypocaust, a heated void beneath the floor, fired by a furnace, allowing hot air to circulate and warm the room above. This system was used in warm and hot rooms of bath complexes and, especially in the northern provinces, became fairly common in many private houses. Technically, it was a remarkable advance in the history of comfort, underfloor heating, heat channeled through walls, and a more stable indoor environment. Socially, however, the central question remained the same: who enjoyed that degree of control every day? For the wealthy, temperature itself could become part of domestic life. For the majority, warmth was usually accessed on the schedule of public baths or determined by the limits of their dwelling. Power in Rome did not govern only land and people. it also sought to govern time. In its later form, the Roman Republican calendar had grown disorderly. It drifted from the solar year, and the mechanism for adding intercalary months could be manipulated by those holding religious political authority. In 46 BCE, Julius Caesar carried out a sweeping reform, creating the Julian calendar as a new dating system based on a 365 and a quarter day year with a leap year cycle. Administratively, this was a major standardization. Agricultural seasons, terms of office, obligations, and rituals were brought back toward a common measure. Yet, like written law, a standardized calendar did not erase inequality. It merely made the machinery of rule less ambiguous. Rich and poor lived under the same calendar, but not with the same power to command the rhythm of life. Once time had been standardized, distance was the next thing to be mastered. The Roman road system, with major routes radiating outward from Rome, transformed travel from a matter of chance into something calculable. The Via Appia, begun in 312 BCE, became the model for that ambition. Along these roads, the cursus publicus, the state postal and transport system, among the most highly developed in the ancient world, depended on relay stations placed at practical intervals and tied closely to the military and administrative apparatus. This was the infrastructure of empire, but not neutral infrastructure. It served above all official business, commands, taxation, and the state's ability to make its presence felt across distance. Ordinary people traveled the same roads, but not with the same priority. Once distance had been disciplined, exchange required another common language, money. As Rome developed its monetary system, it used clearly marked units of value, from the as to the uncia, so that conversion, wages, debt payments, and taxation increasingly rested on standards that could be checked. Coinage, therefore, was not merely metal, it was discipline. Behind that discipline stood an entire world of mining and metallurgy. The Romans did not always produce extraordinary metallurgical breakthroughs, but they made important organizational contributions, especially in expanding the brass industry and improving the administration of mining. This is a familiar Roman pattern, not always the first to invent, but exceptionally skilled at turning technique into a system that could operate at great scale. In the workshops, social hierarchy appears in the objects themselves. Production and trade in Rome were often organized on the scale of households or family workshops, frequently relying on slave labor and the labor of freedmen. At the same time, market demand split into two broad channels. The masses needed durable, inexpensive goods, while the wealthy pulled demand toward refined and luxurious items. For that reason, pottery and glass are not merely archaeological finds. They are traces of a social structure of consumption. Fine red gloss aretine became one of the Roman ceramic types distributed widely across the empire, and glassblowing in the Roman world stimulated growth by making possible both delicate luxury items and mass-produced containers on a large scale. Rome, in effect, industrialized differences in taste. If class reveals itself by day in doorways, markets, clothing, and money, it is ultimately preserved in how Romans wish to be seen. The Colosseum, which held roughly 50,000 people, allowed citizens to attend without charge, yet the best seats were reserved for senators and honored guests. Even in entertainment, order was arranged by seating. And yet those in the lower ranks did not abandon the desire to be remembered. Columbaria, often associated with burial societies of the lower and middle strata in the early empire, offer them an organized form of commemoration. A funerary relief portrait, such as those often identified with prosperous freedmen, shows this aspiration in stone. Rome did not only distribute the conditions of life, it also distributed memory. To understand class in Rome, look first at bread before marble. A vast city could not remain calm if grain arrived late. Britannica's evidence makes this clear. In the 2nd century, the urban poor lived precariously, dependent on public grain distributions and on the charity of the wealthy. Ostia served as a commercial hub and storage center for Rome's food supply. It also functioned as a station for ships bound for Portus. When the older harbor system revealed its limits, Trajan added the hexagonal basin, an engineering solution to a political problem. For in Rome, logistics was not merely transport. Logistics was order. When ships arrived in season, the forum remained quiet. When the supply chain faltered, inequality first appeared in the line of those waiting for their ration. From a grain kernel, we see what Rome rarely stated aloud. Poverty was not only a lack of money, but a lack of stable rhythm. Britannica describes a distinctly Roman contradiction: broad commerce and a large administrative system, yet relatively little industry. As a result, the urban poor struggled to find regular work. They lived by short-term labor, day wages, subsidies, and patronage ties in times of need. In that same city, trade remained lively, and a significant share of it passed through the hands of freedmen. The result was a striking scene: crowded streets, busy markets, monumental buildings. Yet beneath the surface, a layer of people always standing at the edge of uncertainty. Rome could organize roads, laws, and ritual with great skill, but for the majority of the poor, the hardest thing to obtain was still the certainty of tomorrow. When hunger is temporarily quieted, the next gate is education. And in Rome, it was a gate that opened narrowly. Britannica shows that the Romans early recognized the value of Greek and the art of rhetoric, because in political and legal life, speech carried the weight of power. Yet that path was not shared equally by every household. Children of families with means received more systematic training through tutors and family networks. For the majority, even when education was available, it rarely brought them into the same world of public speech. Ironically, the grammatici, teachers of grammar and literature, often belonged to lower strata, sometimes even dependent ones. They helped shape the language standards that elites used to distinguish themselves from common people. In Rome, knowledge was both a ladder and a guarded gate. If schooling was a path upward through letters, military service was a path upward through discipline. Yet even inside the camp, class was clearly arranged. Britannica notes that the army under Augustus consisted of legions and auxiliary forces, with different terms of service and positions. A legionary was a Roman citizen upon enlistment or before it. Many auxiliary soldiers, by contrast, received citizenship only upon discharge. That difference shows that the army did not erase legal hierarchy. It administered it. Even so, Rome also used the army to assimilate the empire. Provincials served, were discharged, settled, and carried Roman habits with them. The camp, therefore, was both an instrument of war and a workshop for shaping status. Discipline could open a road, but always on the state's terms. From the military camp, we move to a larger question: who counted as Roman? Rome's answer changed over time, but was never an unconditional gift. Citizenship was tied to legal standing, obligations, and privileges. Britannica on Civitas emphasizes that only in 212 did the Edict of Caracalla extend citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire. It was a major expansion. Yet legal paperwork did not dissolve old walls overnight. After the boundary of citizenship widened, differences in wealth, lineage, education, and local networks still determined who was heard. Rome was highly skilled at unifying through legal structures, but legal unification on paper did not mean equality in lived experience. The empire widened the legal circle, but the center of power remained with those who already possessed influence. For that reason, Roman law was both a bridge across the empire and a net of stratification. Britannica states clearly, jus civil originally applied to citizens, while jus gentium was developed as a more flexible framework for disputes involving foreigners and was gradually used more broadly by magistrates. This was a remarkable organizational achievement. Rome did not allow differences of status to shatter exchange. Rome created a legal layer practical enough for trade, administration, and the courts to keep functioning. But such sophistication did not eliminate unequal resources. In the same commercial dispute, the wealthy could litigate longer, hire better advocates, and exert influence more easily. The poor often entered court only after being driven into a corner. Law made the empire move. Class determined who could move with fewer losses. Within the household, class appears less noisily than in the marketplace, yet more enduringly than the noise of the street. Britannica shows that in the Middle Republic an important shift took place, from forms of marriage that placed a wife under the property authority of her husband's household toward more common free marriage, in which the wife no longer entered the husband's property regime in the old way. At the same time, patria potestas kept the father at the center of family authority. The result was not modern equality, but a rearrangement of power designed to preserve lines of property. For wealthy families, marriage was a strategy of alliance and inheritance. For poor families, it was often a strategy of survival. Rome did not stratify only in the forum. It placed hierarchy at the table, in the dowry, and in the power to decide the legacy of the next generation. Once wealth had accumulated sufficiently, another contest began, the contest over the right to display it. Britannica preserves a sharp portrait of Cato as censor in 184 BCE. He cast himself as a guardian of morals, punishing luxury through taxation and supporting sumptuary laws. These measures sought to limit jewelry, banquets, and conspicuous consumption, as though the state could place boundaries around desire by legal clause. Yet the same evidence also reveals the central paradox. Competition among aristocrats itself encouraged ostentation, art collecting, and construction as a means of winning prestige. Rome condemned luxury and rewarded it at the same time when luxury was converted into reputation. Class here was not merely a matter of who was richer. It was a matter of who had the authority to turn personal extravagance into a social norm. Even before the gods, Rome did not allow secular order to disappear. Britannica describes the Romans as famous for an almost technical precision in prayer and sacrifice. At the same time, civic priesthoods such as pontifex and augur were entrusted to the senatorial elite, allowing political advantage to reappear within public religion. Another Britannica source likewise emphasizes that most Roman priesthoods are held by men already prominent in public life, and these offices carried considerable social prestige. Thus, public religion in Rome was not only belief. It was a mechanism for coordinating symbols, through which the state staged legitimacy, while the ruling class retained the authority to interpret omens, ritual, and the timing of action. Sacred order was, more often than not, an extension of political order. By the end of this journey, rich and poor in Rome no longer appears as a simple contrast between a full banquet table and an empty room. It appears as a mechanism: housing, clean water, grain, work, schooling, military service, law, marriage, consumption, ritual, and memory. Each part may seem separate. Taken together, they form a technology of rule on an imperial scale. Roman civilization therefore leaves two impressions at once: the beauty of organization and the coldness of hierarchy. Britannica notes that the Colosseum held about 50,000 spectators. A Britannica video also explains that citizens could attend free of charge, but the best seats were reserved for senators and honored guests. That is Rome in a single frame. All may attend, but not all occupy the same place. I invite you to subscribe to the channel as we move next into the axis of technology.